communication through long distance methods, or just like shared interactions of sharing what your day looks like. We think obviously there's like a priority in the minds of a person in terms of physical like companionship. We think communication or just like this care, respect, and like an ability to share about your life are just as important because they create comfort in relationships. We think communication becomes just as important then. We think com- we think companionship in themselves, when it's expanded to these things, notes that we think then that sharing of spaces is not just the most important thing in the world physically, which means that sharing spaces through a Zoom call or sharing spaces through communication or pre-planning dates, which will be of physical nature, are just as important in this scenario. I think the trade-off is obviously that you can't meet each other every day, or you do not meet each other every day, but the impact is on three levels. One, learning to respect choices that individuals make apart from the physical living space that you are forced to share on ops world. That is to say that your prioritization of time might just be different in this world. We think it's a problem on op because if you prioritize time, even if you're living together, the other individual might feel neglected, or the individual is more likely to feel that this other person does not want to spend time with them and they're alone at home. But secondly, we think spaces to grow individually are just not limited to the spaces of mind and office, but also limited, also expanded to individuals on how they shape their room or how they want to live, or their habits of leaving the towel at a certain place or leaving the toilet seat at a certain place. We think these habits are extremely important for this individual in the way that they have shaped their life and in the way that they want to move forward, which means that certain habits might be incompatible with the habits of someone that you're sharing a room with. We think the problem then in this debate is that when certain habits between two people who love each other immensely and want each other there physically all the time are extremely incompatible with each other, the chances that their relationship might go sour because of the fights that happen because of this incompatibility are much higher in that scenario. We think thirdly, we're okay with this temporary deprivation of not meeting the person you love so much all the time, but we're okay with that person being forced to learn and love and respect you eventually. Before I move forward, I'll take opening.
To be clear, you think this motion primarily applies to premarital couples, i.e., before marriage and before having children?
No, I think this debate can be people post-marriage also. The fact is that people post-marriage also need to grow, also need to have their own spaces, which essentially becomes a problem. The issue here is that individuals, especially women in developing nations, are forced to work around the culture of what the man puts on the table according to his work culture, especially in spaces where they're forced to live there. Where like I've heard my mother arguing about how she does not have a space to her own in a house so many times. But secondly, why this distance or unshared space is beneficial. We think lives of long-term couples are also as much about the relationship, but also about their own lives, which means that non-proliferated spaces where they do their own things or where they have their own space to do things are just as important for their own growth and their own path in life. This is true for both premarital and post-marital couples, because individuals are allowed to and should have goals where their life shouldn't just become about this one relationship. We think secondly, usually a couple stays together because their trade-off is not to make the effort to meet. But the problem at that point is if the meeting becomes toxic at a point of time, or if the act of being with someone becomes so tough to sustain, which harms the relationship, we're not okay with that. Thirdly, notice how the primarily your goal of your life might just be your professional goals or other goals that you have in life, which means if you're a lawyer or a painter who spends 12 hours a day teaching or working in the office, and you come back home and you want to spend time in your own space reflecting, the problem is if you continuously do that, you're more likely to make the other person alienated or deprived who's living in the same shared space as you all through time. We think this leads to relationships often suffering. We think this miscommunication or like these things often lead to like people feeling that even if you're in the same space, you can't communicate. We think fourthly, shared things such as shared anxiety and mismanagement also all often lead to like fights on frivolous issues, which leads to people believing they're incompatible on small issues such as the towel being wet on the bed. Very quickly closing. Seeing nothing from them, what is then important in terms of impacts is the sanctity of moments. Notice when you live with someone throughout every single day, where you're also having like these little things that are nagging you off negatively, you're much less likely to care about the moments that you spend together of shared smiles and all that jazz, which means that things such as pre-planning or often lead to like you caring for those moments much more. We think that dry relationships or just feeling bad in relationships or not feeling excited enough at that point of time is much more likely in ops world. Lastly, in terms of how it helps people break the ideals of what ideal relationships looks like in impacts. Notice it's important for you to prioritize your own growth as well, just as like, or just rather than over just this romanticized idea of what shared growth all couples are supposed to have. We think fallouts are just as common. You might know more about. So in ops world, they'll say that relationships are more successful because people know more about each other. The problem is when you know more about each other, you're more likely to hate more things about the other person as well. The impact is that when you shape your life and your physical spaces around this one person, the chances of your relationship becoming emotionally abusive because you're so committed to it and you're so caught up in it, and because you've deprioritized other things, is much more likely. We're here on Opening Government for a Happier Relationship. Very, very proud to witness.
Thank you so much for that fine speech. Now we'd like to go upon the leader of the opposition. You're here.
Okay. Let me just set up my timer. Okay. I will be starting in 3, 2, 1. Not just right off the bat, a bit of mitigation to opening government, because we think they have a very negative view of what relationships are. We think in most healthy relationships, there exists also a healthy level of respect. Insofar as you have spent a large amount of time with a certain person, you know what their interests are, and you know the specific ways in which they want to exercise those interests. Presumably, if you care about them, you're also going to communicate ways as to how you're going to give space to each other, and you've presumably learned that through your relationship. But there's also, secondly, a selfish incentive to do that, because insofar as people do need space apart from each other, as conceded by opening government, and you have an incentive to get that space, you want to give the space to the other partner insofar as you have a leverage to request it for yourself. So I think just a lot of opening government is mitigated, but it also means this debate probably is most impactful in relationships which are not ideal, which is where I think the government case exacerbates harms the most. I'm going to run a bunch of arguments, and rebuttal is going to be integrated. Let's get right into it. First of all, within the government side of the house encourages people to make bad decisions, but also makes them less able to opt out of relationships in the long term. There's a reason why people decide to move in 2 years before they get married. That's because they want to experience life together. Because you may love each other and see each other, but you've never run a budget together. You've never divided chores. You've never spent so much time together, and you haven't learned the most intimate behavioral patterns of that person. The reason why this matters is because we think still a huge amount of individuals are going to want to move in at some point when they get married or have children. First of all, because the majority of society still does that, and you've been told by your parents and grandparents it's a model you want to follow. Secondly, because there's religiously inculcated ideas that marriage is something you want to live in holy communion together. Thirdly, I think there's just pressure from people around you to do that, insofar as people want to see you as a happy family and have their own definition on that. Your family is more likely to pressure you on their side of the house, because like you're building 5 years apart, like what the fuck, move in, start building a family, and start giving us grandchildren. Insofar as a large amount of people are still likely to do that, and government has provided no warrant as to why they're not, we think this is probably going to lead to more failed marriages in the first place. Because the premise of opening government is you have certain habits which make you fight. On the government side of the house, you've never actually learned to deal with those habits. You've never actually had the experience of communicating how to temper those habits to not annoy the other person. At the point when you get married and you become codependent on each other, have absolutely no heuristics as to resolve these issues. So the respect that the government wants is not learned on their side of the house, and you encounter the same problems in the long term, but you encounter them at the point where the level of commitment is far higher than just having an uncommitted relationship, which you can break up at any point, which is both a harm in and of itself, insofar as leads to failed marriages and kids living in unhappy marriages and unhappy families. But secondly, we see on their side of the house, it's just harder to opt out once you do move in. Not that divorce is a very stressful proceeding. It's also costly in terms of having to pay for legal aid, but you're also afraid of the consequences of divorce, particularly if you're a woman, because you may lose custody over your child. You fear that the court is not going to believe your side of the story, and so on and so forth. But secondly, if you do have children, you feel internalized guilt of abandoning these children, but you can also be guilted by your spouse by saying, you have to keep this marriage alive for the sake of our kids. Do not be so selfish. Thirdly, note that you do not want to disappoint your family, who probably has a fantasy that you and your spouse are a happy couple, and you're also probably going to be pushed by your family to keep the marriage alive, insofar as they don't want to see you unhappy. Then they project it onto you and try to tell you, you can talk it out, you just have to, push it through, do not try to end this marriage. But lastly, the longer you live together, the more you're economically codependent, insofar as you have a shared budget, and so on and so forth. Which means that on their side of the house, insofar as a huge amount of people still decide to opt into marriage and having children, at the point where they haven't learned who the person who they're going to live is, at the point where they haven't had a chance to opt out before that level of commitment, or at least developed ways to cope with that character if they're not going to opt out in the first place, we say that one, people are less likely to leave bad relationships, and two, this produces more bad relationships. The reason why this is important is because probably the reason why people do this is because of fundamentally different lifestyles, right? The reason why they make this decision is because they probably perceive some elements of their partner's character that make it impossible to cohabitate. So these are probably relationships which are likely to be unstable anyway. We would like them to break up sooner rather than later. If a couple is going to implode because someone leaves a toilet seat up, I think it's healthy for that couple to implode. But secondly, if they consider this is post-marriage, this is so much worse for them. Because one, I think that your family, your people around you are going to question why you live that way because you're not conform to traditional norms, you don't get to enjoy it. But also second, I think it's horrible for children. First of all, because I think kids lose time with both of their parents. Secondly, there's an incentive for parents to compete with each other. Insofar as you probably share custody over the child, you want to compete in terms of being the more fun parent, the more permissive parent, which both creates envy in terms of who the child likes more, but also conflict in terms of how you raise the child and making the relationship more unstable. But lastly, insofar as most families are still traditional, I think just hard for the kids. They're going to be asked questions like, do your parents not love each other? Why are your parents divorced? Having to explain that all the time, I think is just horrible for children. But I think just generally, this is bad for relationships and creates bad relationship dynamics. First of all, because I think this encourages people to fear codependency. Insofar as the rationale behind this is we want each other's space, confiding in your partner is seen as breaking those boundaries and becoming codependent. This means that people are less likely to confide in their partner, but secondly, insofar as they're less likely to communicate issues within the relationship, they're more likely to be communicated too late or not be communicated at all, which means that you are less likely to be able to solve problems once they arise. But secondly, I think this engenders doubt, because I think for people, especially insecure people, always ask themselves the question, why is my partner proposing that we live apart from each other? There has to be a reason. So it can be either one, they genuinely don't enjoy my presence, which I think fosters feelings of self-doubt. You're less able to enjoy the relationship. You overthink it rather than enjoy it, which can also create negative behavioral patterns. But secondly, you presume negative intention part of your partner. They must be cheating. They must be hiding something from me. I think that makes abusive relationships worse, because what abusers want in relationships is the feeling of control. At the end of the day, this person comes home and I have some kind of oversight over them. When they don't have this oversight, they're more likely to be controlling, to aggressively question that person as to their whereabouts, to gaslight them and accuse them of doing something behind their back, to being more controlling, try to get their password to their Facebook to control their communication, try to control their bank account and what they spend on, generally spy on that person, which engenders conflict, but also means more aggression, more violence, people get hurt physically and mentally. It's horrible. Before I move on to the last argument, I'll take closing government.
Do you think your family is more likely to pressure you to live together if you're the only couple they've ever seen living apart, or if there's a general trend in society that normalizes this?
This trend has to be a huge, dominant trend that most people do and that overcomes traditional norms inculcated through tradition, through religion, and through culture for decades in order for this to become as normal as you would want it. Otherwise, you're still probably mostly surrounded by traditional marriages unless you're a hipster in downtown New York. Final argument. Why do you think this is economically bad? Not that the most middle-class people just cannot afford to own a flat, or it's simply very hard for them to do, but just two consequences. One, on our side of the house, I think people are just better able to make economic decisions insofar as they have a shared budget, which they discuss, but just have a large amount of money to pull together. But secondly, more importantly, the space and leisure that the government team wants is more likely to accrue on our side of the house. Because if you have a shared budget, it's probably more likely to be money left at the end of the month that you can spend on leisure and your hobbies. Whereas if you're living alone, as an average middle-class person or a student on a student loan, you have to work two fucking jobs to be able to pay your condo. You don't have time for yourself. You don't have time for your hobbies. You're unhappy and you're alone. For all of these reasons, we think that opening opposition clearly takes this debate.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. And now we would like to call upon the Deputy Prime Minister. Can you hear?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Go, give me 1 second. Okay. We'll do, okay. 3, 2, 1. Let's go. The problem with opening opposition's case is the fact that they're vastly concentrated upon individuals who are long-term couples and are more likely to get married. I really want to point it out at this point in time is that things or benefits or harms which accrue to things such as familial pressure, things such as budgetary, like better budgetary management, or things such as divorce, like the impacts of divorce, are largely contingent to only couples which are more likely to get married. It's important to understand that even though there is a trend wherein couples do get married, but in vast amount of instances who are like in long-term relationship don't get married. It's still a minority of cases wherein individuals don't end up getting married together, and vast amount of individuals who do end up in a long-term relationship, which is let's say like 1 year or 2 year long, are people who are still trying to understand each other, and they don't have a definitive understanding of what their future looks like. Which means that if this debate has to be like how do I say, decided from a vast majority of consideration how the vast majority of world looks like, it's less likely that their case becomes the majority to begin with. Okay, so first level of rebuttal on opening opposition. Firstly, I think opening opposition says that your ability to like, how do I say, to make yourself better individual and more adaptable to other individual, it's important to live together. I'm not really sure where the premise of that comes to, but there are two bases on opening opposition that contends. Firstly, on the basis of habits, and two, on the basis of behavior. So firstly, habits. Notice that even if there are habits which are incompatible with other person, we are not likely to sure that why these habits are likely to lead to acts such as divorce and are likely to lead things such as breakups. There are smaller habits which are largely incompatible with other individuals at large, but these are habits which may lead to anxiety, may lead to infights, but don't lead to uh, active breakup, like active divorces to begin with. Which means that even on opening opposition, these are like a likely harm, but on our side of the house, when you live together and these habits don't overlap, that's a definite harm to begin with. But secondly, habits are easily overridden, which means that in vast amount of instances, so even if you have to eventually get married, you will co-opt into those spaces and you will let go of those bad habits anyway. Which means that habits are not inherently going to be a deal breaker, and it cannot be a primary consideration when we see that whether these individuals are co-opting into each other or not. But secondly, on the idea of behavior, opening opposition says that these behavior, it's important for you to like make yourself a better individual because you can adjust your behavior to them. That is true, but I'm not really sure adjusting, like what behavior do you necessarily need to, can what behavior can only be adjusted when you live in like live in the same house. I think in vast amount of instances, how you treat another individual, how aggressive you are, or how toxic you are, vast most amount of things can be adjusted by simply like co-sharing spaces in multiple times, that other individual coming over to your house for a movie night, or things such as like sleeping in together, or things such as going out together, or spending vast amount of day together. I'm not really sure that constantly being in touch, being in communication, how does that in like change in behavior is so exclusive to living in together and can only happen when you like 24-hour is around each other. Which means in vast amount of instances, individuals can still explore each other to the best possible extent by not living in together. Which means that in opening opposition's best damages are still like likely outcome, but are not definite outcomes. So what does opening government give to you in this speech? But before that, closing. Nothing. Opening.
Sure. So your argument is that you're going to let go of bad habits when you marry, and habits aren't a deal breaker. PM says that there are some habits that are so salient that you don't want to live together because those habits just piss you off so much. Which one is it?
Yeah. So here's what we're saying, right? Vast amount of couples who decide on marrying will definitely let go of those habits. But the problem is that it's very few people who actively decide to marry, but most couples who are in long-term relationships are individuals who just like want to live with one another. Which means that in vast amount of instances, these habits are likely to lead to things such as active anxiety or like infighting, which deteriorates your like quality of relationship even in a stage when you're actively like exploring another person. This is the problem, right? Because even if like it's true that towards a certain extent like you can let go of them, but in a lot of instances individuals are not capable of dealing with them. I think habits come on a like a very lower scale of priorities when you decide when you want to marry another individual, and at a point in time these individuals are clear that they want to marry. They already are decided that sure, we'll make certain changes in our character at a point in time when it becomes necessary to begin with. Well, what's the premise of opening government's case? I think the premise of opening government's case is important to realize that there is individual life that individuals need to consider, but secondly that there are most relationships who are, even if long term, do fall apart. The problem is that relationships do fall apart because of a couple of reasons. One, there is infidelity, things such as individuals growing simply out of love, or three, that there is a lack of excitement and individuals don't feel like that they are like being fulfilled by another individuals, or fourthly, like individuals always feel that they're being neglected simply because the other person is involved in things such as working for like 16 or 18 hours. We think that these considerations continue to arrive in a vast period of time for extensively stretching over a long period of time, and these boundaries are far easy to be established when you live in separate houses, when you don't live on the other side of the bed and in the same house, and you don't give attention to another person. We think that it allows you to like generate a far more like a more healthier level of boundaries to begin with. with. But why do we think it's far more problematic in this space? I think that love in vast amount of instances blinds individuals and prevents them from making good choices, because in vast amount of instances it makes sure that the choices that you make are dependent upon each other. Things such as going to college together, things such as moving into another city together, or things such as taking job wherein you're going to be together are choices which may actively harm you on an interpersonal level or your individual growth, because you always think that living with another person gets prioritized over a better paying job, or probably a better or probably moving into a better city, simply because you think that these considerations will last forever. And this is exactly the problem by vast amount of individuals who continue to suffer by the consequence of a long-term relationship falling apart, because they didn't think it through. And the reason why I want to make this argument, that I'll also like argue at this point in time, that love makes you a stupid person, because like it generates dopamine, right? It's it's addictive in and of itself. And at a point in time, like the lack of even if like when you imagine the lack of dopamine that gets produced by the another person initiates anxiety within you, which means you're more likely to take calls which are largely short-term beneficial to you, but may not be beneficial to you in the longer term. Which means that vast amount of individuals who are unable to understand what the relationship will look like coming next 1 year, are individuals who end up taking huge personal harms before realizing what their life will look like. This is exactly the reason why I think like it's a bad thing to move in together, even if you're a long-term couple to begin with. But secondly, notice that breakups, like in vast amount of instances, do get hurt the most. But the reason why we think like toxic relationship and abusive relationship worsen off on our side of the house and are more prevalent on our side of the house is simply because of the fact that you are becoming more codependent and codependent upon another person, in the sense that you cannot like conceive a life independent of them. Which means that you have always spent for the last 2 or 3 years living together with them, and at a point in time when you have to think that okay, it's time for me to move out, you are always scared, because I never have had a house of my own. I have never I have never run a house on my own. I don't know like any other individual or any other friend who like exist outside this other individual's life. Which means in vast amount of instances you generate a shell for yourself which like is extremely tough to break off. And this is the reason why vast amount of toxic and like abusive relationships stretch for a very long period of time and don't implode. They only implode when they have like boundaries which can be easily built, and they can like stick to those boundaries in and of itself. Thank you.
Thank you for that fine speech. Now I would like to call upon the deputy leader of the opposition. Here.
Can I be heard?
Yes, you're audible.
Cool. Opening government is correct. The majority of 1 to 2 year couples do not end up together. Much of that is because of lifestyle choices that different people in different relationships have that are different or unpalatable to your partner. This is fantastic, because quite literally, we would much rather prefer a 1 year couple breaking up because one person just does not put the toilet seat down, or because someone keeps a towel, like the wet towel, on their bed. These are small examples, but I think you get the point. We would much rather that people break up now based off of poor habits, as opposed to getting married and either being forced to give up those habits that you spent 30 years doing, or much worse, have a terrible marriage because you just don't like the things that your partner is doing. You don't like the way that you live. You don't like the choices that you're making in general. And as a result, you find yourself being placed in worse and worse decisions. 10 tells you that not only are there massive pressures to eventually get married and cohabitate, but that when you do this, it is almost impossible to leave, fostering the same problems with emotional dependence that opening government themselves points out. At that point, we'd much rather that you are cognizant of these stresses, cognizant of these worries, far before you ever opt into the point where this becomes irreversible. The thing that I want to talk about is simple. One, I want to talk about what this debate is or is not about. Then I want to talk about new substantive arguments about gender norms, especially in the developing world. I want to talk about what Tin gave you in the LO. Then I want to talk a little bit about the norms and the stress that you impose on people in general. What is this debate not about? This debate is not about the worst forms of relationships. It is not about abuse, because the bottom line, as Tin points out, is that abusers will foster emotional codependence regardless. If they cannot select where you live, they will select your friends or the activities. They will pick apartments that are purposely close by high because they want you to remain codependent on them, whether or not you live apart or together. In fact, it's actually much worse because, as Tin points out, insecure people on their side of the house are so much more insecure. They think their partner is proposing this because they don't like their presence, and they feel forced to do more and more to win their partner's approval. On both sides, controlling people now have an incentive to be more controlling. On our side, it is much worse because you feel more and more pressure because you think your partner just doesn't care about you and doesn't foster the same level of emotional dependency. New substantive argument about gender norms. One, I want to talk about the developing world. Prime Minister says that it's very hard for women to have space because women are expected, and like through gender norms, they have all the pressure to do all sorts of housework. That is to say, they have to take care of their husband, they have to take care of their spouse. Imagine how much worse it is on their side of the house because these same gender norms still apply, but now you have 2 apartments or 2 houses, so you have to do 2 times the housework. It is cooking and cleaning. You're expected to do this for your husband or your significant other still, but you also have to do it for yourself. I think it's just like massively increase the amount of work and decrease the free time and other outside opportunities. Opening like the second thing to say here is that opening government wants to like change this debate so much. Like I think bottom line, OG's probably out because of the severe case tensions in their case, not only because of like the case tensions between PM and DPM, but just because of their framing. Prime Minister concedes that this round is about couples that are married, about couples that are very, very long term, and then DPM tries to walk it back because they realize it's obviously terrible for their side. Too late, you've already accepted it. I think the bottom line is it is much worse for women in general, not just in the developing world, because the lack of emotional intimacy that Tin points out in LO is extraordinarily important. That is to say, Tin points out when you don't live together, you are much less likely to foster emotional bonds because a consequence of you not living together is that there are some things that you want to keep to yourself. There is some reason why you don't want to let your shell down around other people, why you want to remain emotionally guarded. Those are the consequences that often come in choosing to live apart. As a result, I think those relationships just tend to have less emotional intimacy, which hurts women far more than men. Like, it's acceptable in society in general for men to be like the less emotionally committing or the more like philandering part of relationships, i.e. society is much more permissive of men who cheat/roam free than women. So when relationships have less emotional intimacy and are designed to foster less emotional intimacy and commitment, it is actively terrible for women because they are the ones that are most hurt by society's double standard about who can step out, who can't, who needs to be emotionally intimate, and who doesn't. On what Tin gave you in the LO, which I think is just frankly winning, there is so much material that Tin gave you about in and of itself why there is so much pressure to eventually move in and get married. This is your parents, this is religion, this is family, this is the government that offers tax incentives to cohabitate or get married. This is the financial pressure to eventually cohabitate. In that vein, one, the argument that LG misses is that these lifestyle choices that people seem to have that are so different that they have to live together must be extraordinarily severe if they want to overcome all of the current bias towards living together, which means that these lifestyle choices endanger you for a unstable relationship in the first place. But the second thing to say here is just that when you eventually cohabitate, because look, all couples and almost all couples will eventually want to cohabitate. It is easier to raise a family. It is easier to raise kids. It is easier to make those sorts of decisions when you do that. It is so much worse because you've reached the threshold past which there is no return. What else did opening government miss that like closing government should honestly deal with? But I don't know if they can because Tin had like 7 minutes of unresponded to material. Second, that this is just terrible for kids because if you buy opening government standard about who this applies to, it is absolutely terrible to see kids raised in 2 separate households. That this creates bad dynamics in the relationship in and of itself, regardless of whether or not people get married. The amount of insecurity and lack of trust that you foster when you tell your partner, hey, look, I like you, but I don't want to live together. I don't want to live together for the next 2 years because there's just something about you that I do not like living with. That makes people more insecure, makes them more vulnerable for control, and makes it much, much worse writ large. Last, I want to talk about economics and norms, why the CGPOI was just terrible for their side. But hey, CG, if you want to defend yourselves, go ahead.
Why in the developing world, if norms are so sexist that women have to do the housework in 2 houses, would women have the ability to live separately altogether?
I mean, I think there's I'm willing to say this happens much less in the developing world, but I think it's actually quite frequent. Like, think about if you're rich in the developing world, you are much more likely to be able to afford 2 houses in the first place. And maybe like the family of the woman is like, oh, we want a separate house. I don't think it matters. I think the point is that like, you can have norms that are sexist that encourage women to cook and clean because that's what society wants them to do, irrespective of whether or not women are literally allowed to be outside of their own house. Like in America, which is a pretty not sexist country, I think there are still pressures on women to cook and clean. And like, it's also totally fine for like women to live in separate apartments. So I think the CGPOI is crazy. The other CGPOI about norms in general. If closing government is right, that this motion supports norms and that norms impose pressure on lots of people, this is terrible. Because right now, I'd say like couples that like live apart is like probably like maybe 8-9% of total couples that are in long-term romantic relationships. So thinking about how massive the change has to be in order for them to correctly normalize it. It impacts kids much worse because, as Tim points out, most couples that stay together and most couples that live together are the ones that have kids. So if you want to affect it, you need to affect all those relationships. It also imposes undue financial pressures on the average person. Like, look, the average person cannot sustain 2 households. They can't sustain 2 apartments even. It is much easier to make financial decisions, and you are more able to make financial decisions when you make them together as a couple and you live together as a couple rather than making them separately. All of those things become much worse on low-income couples if closing government is correct and this becomes normalized. Very proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. And I would like to call upon the member for the government. Here.
Or you're on mute.
Good. You're muted, I think. Hopefully.
Oh yeah, am I audible? I should get my paper tomorrow. Yeah. Okay, wait, where was it? Okay, these two. And this. Great. What's missing in this round so far is a real characterization of why couples actually do this when there are all kinds of emotional reasons that people want to live together, that people want to raise kids together because they love each other, they want to have sex. I think that's missing from top half. There's 2 misconceptions. First, I think opening government's misconceptions that there are lifelong habits that don't coalesce and people just don't want to live together because you don't point the toilet seat up or down. Maybe this is true in a minority of cases, and we think their arguments are persuasive in those cases. I think what's vastly more likely is that women increasingly want the ability to forge their own careers without being subordinate to their male partners and having to subordinate their financial decisions and their financial stability to their male partners. So I think what that means, I think on our side of the house, we're going to talk about why this trend is crucial for giving women more freedom to do what they want, both in terms financially and in the long term. Second, opening opposition, I think, is completely wrong about the idea that people commit to long-term relationships and because of a purely social pressure. I think on our side of the house, it's more likely that people just have more optionality, that is to say, maybe there's financial reasons that you don't want to live together, at least temporarily. Maybe you want to see your family, maybe you want to take care of your dying parent for a year and a half before you move in with your significant other. We think on our side of the house, there's significantly less social pressure forcing you to move in together because there's so many other examples of it in society. So with that said, 2 extensions from closing government, rebuttal will be integrated. First, why you get less social pressure on our side of the house, and second, why you liberate women in the long term. First, and rebuttal will be integrated. First, why do you get less social pressure on our side of the house? I actually think that the opening opposition argument here is a little bit crazy. They say that as you know, after like 3 or 4 years in a relationship, like when you're like living in a long-term relationship, and you're very far apart from each other, your family's going to force you to get married because you've been dating for so long. There are at least 2 problems with this. First, your family is much less likely to force you to get married if there are lots of other examples of people who have lived apart and don't get married for long periods of time because that's the norm. And to be clear, we're not saying that this is going to be a super widespread thing, that every couple is going to raise children from different halves of of the country. But we think that when there's even a few examples, it's going to be easier. I'll recognize that in a second. But second, I just don't think that, I think on our side of the house, it's much easier to break up with someone. That is to say, if you're living far apart from them, there's going to be less of a reason to actually, that you have to stay together in the long term. So maybe they don't even reach this point where you've been dating long term for like 4 or 5 years and your family pressures you to finally move in together. Lastly, I just want to say, I think that they say that it's important to know how to divide chores. Clearly, I think people are going to move in together for some period of time before they get married. They're still going to make reasonable decisions about this. I know the LO gives lots of mechanisms. I just don't think they're very good. I don't think they're winning their argument. Why on our side of the house do you get more optionality? I think there's a few reasons. And again, again, I just want to be clear that like if this is really bad for women, so for example, if like a woman doesn't want to do the cooking and cleaning in two houses, they can just say no. They can just move in with their partner. Like this is really just more options for people that can only make their relationships better and more easily accessible. I think a few reasons we get more optionality. First, because I think you're vastly more likely to be stigmatized by friends and family if there are no other examples of people in long-term relationships not living together. So if you want to take care of your dying parent, but your family, or you want to, or sorry, I guess if you want to be in a different part of the country for economic reasons, then your family is going to say, no, you shouldn't do that. Clearly, that's crazy. Whereas at least on our side, you can point and say, hey, look at these people in your social circle who've done it. It's not everyone, but we can do it for 2 years and it's going to be fine. Second, I think people themselves don't even think of this option. That is to say, the norm of living together was previously so ingrained that people didn't even think there was a possibility that they could live apart. So I think you just get more optionality on that other side of the house. 3, I think you're less likely to be dismissed in discussions. That is to say, your male partner may not say, you don't love me unless you live with me, because they've seen other examples of this happening and maybe it's even happened to them before in their life. I want to be clear that this flips almost the entirety of opening opposition's analysis, whether it's about gender norms, whether it's about the pressure to eventually move in and get married. Everything that Aditya says is the most important part of their contribution is completely flipped. I don't know why this made this argument. I think it's completely counterintuitive. I think this trend can only give people more optionality. Opening, save yourself.
This is a crazy argument. Not only does closing government strawman us by saying, I just don't believe their reasons, which, guys, come on, it's a debate, like actually respond to them. But the bigger problem is it has to be so massive. Like, think about how small the current trend is. In order to convince everyone that this is normal, you have to have like 80% of couples doing this.
I've already answered this. So Plum and I are dating. We're going to be living in a long distance relationship for the next few years. And Aditya, you can tell your parents about that, even though all of your friends may not be doing it. So I think you only need a few examples for these conversations to make sense. And look, maybe we're not going to change the most conservative people's minds. We'll bite that bullet. You already agreed that that's likely not be the delta in the debate at the end of your dialogue. Second extension, why do women get significantly more freedom both in terms of their career and in the long term? I think first, this normalizes the idea that women don't have to be subordinate to their husbands. That is to say, there's massive social pressure in the status quo for actually women to live with men in the short term. And I think on our side of the house, I think there's less likely to be that social pressure, which means that women can prioritize their careers. I think second, this is a particularly effective trend because it's so visible. That is to say, if a woman is prioritizing her career, but like in some other way, it's not obvious that she's doing it. But if she's explicitly not living with someone else, like, maybe she's not living with her husband even in the most extreme example, although we do think that's probably a minority of examples, then it's easy for you as like a young girl or even as one of her friends to see that she's prioritizing her career and you feel more empowered to do that too. Finally, I think that this also means that even in the long term within relationships, men are more likely to see it as like for example, if a woman has the option to live apart from the man and the man knows that, and it, like maybe in a slightly conservative part of the world, for example, then the man is more likely to try to be nice, more flexibility within the current arrangements so they don't move away from them. So even if you don't live in long-term relationships, I think women get substantially more flexibility because it's an option that's on the table. This beats all of opening opposition's harms because you don't actually have to live long distance to get the benefits here. It actually just improves the quality of the relationship. I want to talk about why this is actually more important, even if you believe everything that opening opposition says. First, I think that this is probably the most important way to reduce pressure on women in the long term. The primary pressure on women isn't just social, it's financial. It's that if you sacrifice your career to live with your boyfriend for 3 years, even if you don't want to marry them, and even if your family's not pressuring you to marry them, if you don't have any financial prospects, you feel that you have to do so because you have given up all other financial alternatives to live with him. I think on our side of the house, it's much less likely that that's going to happen. Second, I don't think this is necessarily going to continue into marriage. So for example, like after you've been dating for 4 or 5 years or 6 years or something, maybe you're able to figure out a way to reconcile both your interests and live together. But even if it does, I actually think this is probably good for kids because A, I think it means that there's more sources of financial stability for the children, which means that, for example, if the husband is being abusive or even if the wife's being abusive, then they can live with the other one because everyone's not in the same household. I think it means that there's more financial stability. So if one partner loses their job, the kid doesn't have to get pulled out of school and move to a different location. It means that the kid is more able to access a better quality of life. 3, I also just think it's a good role model for daughters. That is to say, it's nice, it's good for them to see that their mothers are working, they're not sacrificing for their careers. This literally liberates half of the population, or so the press propose.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. And now I would like to call upon the member for the opposition. You're here.
Can you hear me well?
Yes, I can hear you.
Thank you. 3, 2, 1. 1 point of framing, 2 points of rebuttal, then extension. In terms of framing, I think the reasonable way to read this debate is that it is probably most impactful for those couples that actually consider this to be a viable long-term option for themselves, i.e. at the point where you don't, then you probably reverse engineer that to indicate that you shouldn't be living like that early either. I think that means that the most relevant couples are the ones that actually perceive this as being relevant for themselves into the future. I think we'll also be reasonable and take God at their best and say that like probably those people exist. Like I agree, it will probably be more the hipsters in New York than the people who live in super conservative communities, but I'm also unsure why the people in super conservative communities are then negatively impacted in the way that other people are claiming in this debate. 2 points of rebuttal. A, on opening government, kind of also on closing government, that you make worse choices because you don't maximize for your career and therefore you don't find values. Like, I just think that this requires a massive like intuition gap for you to apply, which is that people otherwise make great choices about their career. Like reality check, most people are deceived into what is good for them in terms of their career. Most jobs kind of really, really suck and require that you get emotional support or alcohol at the end of the day. They are frustrating, they're annoying. You believing that moving to like insert big city instead of staying with your relationship is better for you, I have no idea why it actually is. I'm pretty sure Gov teams would have needed to actually analyze that prior to GovWhip in order to actually get any like meaningful mileage out of it. They literally just assert it. I have no idea why, oh, I will go to like other city for a better paying job is good for me if that job is also emotionally abusive. Like, what the fuck? Secondly, presumably, that I think it's actually relatively likely that I make vaguely okay decisions about the relationship that I stay with, insofar as I have already got some experience with that relationship as is. I've already interacted with them. I presumably know how they make me feel, etc. At which point, if anything, you're making a slightly more informed decision to stay than to leave. Secondly, with regard to freedom for women from closing government, I'm sure Lucy has like more structural rebuttal to this. I'm just going to intuition prompt that for the husbands that are probably like most affected by this norm and who are most willing to take it as at face value and believe that it doesn't mean that their wife doesn't love them less. I just think that they're pretty good support to have around. Let me intuition prompt this. When I came home from debating tournaments, where I was treated like trash because I was, sounding screechy, having like my ex-boyfriend actually like be willing to listen to me and comfort me was pretty good. If we hadn't been living together at that point, what I would have done is go home by myself and not talk to him about it, because I would have felt like a complainy little bitch and like he wouldn't like me anymore if I did that, because that would have been the easier option. Being that we lived together, he saw me crying about it, he checked in and he tried to make sure that I was okay. That is a positive mechanism that helps people deal with and confront the bad things in their life more effectively. Why do you make ultimately better choices on opposition side? A, with regard to worse communication, I think opening opposition, being reasonable to 10, explain why you don't bring up problems effectively and therefore you don't effectively resolve them within your relationship on GovBench. However, it is relatively unclear within them why you do effectively resolve them at the point where you live together. We're going to give you 3 broad headlines in terms of why you do so. The first is that you are forced by the fact that there is a norm of moving in together on opposition, that you see everyone actually doing it relatively early, to confront difference in expectation about your relationship. I.e., if after 2 or 3 years your partner is not proposing that you move in together and you aren't feeling like you can propose it easily, you will know that there is actually an issue in your relationship, that there's a difference in expectation, which will prompt you to effectively communicate about that. That means that it is relatively significantly easier for you to make decisions about whether you want to commit further to this relationship. If there is not something that is as clear an indicator, that makes it harder for you to make those decisions, and it means that you're more likely to be caught off guard. Note that most other forms of relationship commitment are ultimately about words, and they are even at the point where you are getting married, at the point where you don't live together, getting married is a much lower level commitment. It means that you're less certain about whether your partner is just doing this out of conflict avoidance or because it's convenient or because they haven't gotten around to replacing you in a relationship yet. That means that on our side, you have much more certainty that is able to confirm to you what is going on. Secondly, communication at low points. That means that at the point where you are not living together, there's a couple of things that make this difficult. The first is that it's just hard to be the first mover to be vulnerable in any given relationship, because you feel like it's unclear that whether the other person is actually as serious about it. But there's also just the insecurity about being a bother that I flagged earlier in my intuition pump. And you don't necessarily understand why something makes you feel bad, and you don't necessarily fully follow what is going on. At the point where you live together, there is a default that at some stage while you're feeling bad, you will be in the same place. And the fact that your partner cares about you, they have empathy, meaning that when they see you feel bad, they feel bad in a similar way and they want to resolve it out of the impulse to no longer feel bad. And because it's much harder for you to practice avoidance, and avoidance in itself is a signal that something is wrong, meaning they will actively check up on you because they realize something is wrong, as opposed to, your home, in your own home, the way you are every night, being separate, meaning it is much likelier that you actually confront what is going on, meaning that you actually resolve this. That is something that is likely responded to by providing support to you, by allowing you to sort of explain yourself and explain what is going on in your mind to your partner, meaning that they will effectively respond to you. This is more important than the stuff on falling out of love with someone that we get from opening government, or stuff on excitement, because I think excitement is just ultimately much less important than you feeling like your partner cares about you and is effectively providing you emotional support. Even if my partner excites me, if they don't provide that, I am sad, I am heartbroken, I don't want to be around them, even if I am the reason, my avoidant behavior is the reason that they're not providing that. OG, 15 seconds, go.
In a world where you're extremely vulnerable and tired yourself, what is this obligation of being forced to interact at all points of times without any personal space with other
I'm
people?
sorry, OG, I have no idea why the fuck you think that being alone when you are tired and sad is actually good for you. It's likelier to lead to you going to bed over a bottle of wine and being equally sadder in the morning. I have no idea why that's good. Secondly, why you make better relationship choices ultimately about things. I think the first thing is that you are likely to say that you see habits that will break up a relationship. There's a question though, which is why you act on those things correctly. There's two reasons for this. A, you are likely to experience urgency, i.e. the thing annoys you repeatedly, and at some point that overflows to the point that you think that there's a concrete reason to take on the short-term cost of a social conflict with your partner, where they will frown at you and be sad. This means that you communicate. If the communication fails, it escalates into a fight, and it gives you the emotional legitimation that you need in order to leave, meaning that you take the correct response to unresolvable problems. The second layer is that given how big of a materially important step moving in together is, you're likely to have scrutiny by others, your parents, your friends, etc., at that step because they think it is important to do so. This is significantly likelier to be avoided if it's just an over time gradual process. If there is a single step that is materially significant, you're likely to get that advice and therefore be more able to confront necessary information for all of those reasons.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. Now, I would like to call upon the government whip. You're here.
Can people hear me?
Yes.
Is there anything else that you would about CO that you want me to say? Sorry. Great. I think it is outrageous that it took until closing government, aside from a half-hearted attempt from the DLO, to give a real argument about the people who are benefited most by this trend. That is, women who feel that they cannot prioritize their careers because they feel that they must stay in the same place as their husband, as his career, for their children, or for a host of other social reasons. I think that we gave you two extensions of the closing government, neither of which got adequate engagement from closing opposition. I'm going to talk about them each in turn, then I'm going to talk about direct comparisons to other teams. First extension on optionality. The first actually gives you a number of reasons why, aside from the ambiguous stuff about having incompatible habits from opening government, why it might actually be a good choice for some couples to be long distance. That is, A, you might have it might be a matter of financial necessity. Maybe one partner has a really good financial opportunity in another city and has to go move there. B, maybe you have to move in with your parents to take care of them or that sort of thing. Or maybe you want to have your parents help out raise your kids. Or C, and most importantly, what I'm going to talk about later, maybe you're a woman who doesn't want to give up their career for their superstar husband. Now, Asher gives you a bunch of reasons why all the arguments that OO gives you about social pressures actually flow in our direction. That is, if you believe that right now there is massive social stigma against this, I think OO is correct. You're not going to get rid of 100% of the stigma. So I don't think you're going to trigger the worst case scenario outlined in the bottom of the DLO about all the households living like this. But I do think that you're going to give a subset of people who might feel that this is the right choice for them, but might not feel that they have the ability to do so because of social stigma, the ability to engage this behavior. Actually gives you a number of reasons about this. At first, it's the sort of thing that feels more present to your mind. It seems like an option versus it doesn't. That your partner will be less upset if they don't do this. That it reduces the stigma if you don't see any examples. Note that we don't need to win, that this is a large social trend in order to win this impact. That is, you only need a couple of examples of a friend doing this in order to feel like, oh, that is an option that people do. And I think you're likely to hear about it because people talk about it. There's really no responses from CO. Second extension is about women. Actually gives you a number of mechanisms here about how you need to normalize the idea that women can prioritize their career. And second, that even if women do not, as a result, live in another house, that they might still feel, because of the example, that other women are upset, because that example is so visible. It's different. You don't know if women are prioritizing their career over their husband unless they're literally in different cities, because that's the most visible way to do it. And that this is why we think that it's like that women in general feel more okay prioritizing their careers. Now, to this, CGCO does give a few responses. They say that first, that husbands are likely to support you, and so it's actually good for women. One, if that's true, I think women most likely know that. They can take it into their calculus, especially if CO is correct, as they say, that you make a more informed decision and have more information about your relationship. If that's still true and you still don't want to do this, clearly that's something you've considered. But second, I think that if you have a reasonably healthy relationship with your husband, you can simply call them when you need support. I don't think this is that big a deal. The only other thing that CO says in response is that it's bad to move for a job because a job might suck. One, I think women can consider the fact that their jobs suck. Like maybe they don't have total information about their new job, but they've had an old job before, so they understand what that's like. But two, I think that even if it's true, it's less restrictive. That is, if you take a new job and you are more financially independent, it's easier to leave that new job versus it is harder to leave your husband, so it's comparatively better. The impacts are clear. One, you have financial independence about marriage, which means all those impacts about having social pressure to commit get less bad in our worlds. And second, it's good for kids for the host of reasons that Asher given you. I want to do now correct comparison to everyone else on opening government. 3 reasons why we take it over them. One, OGI just doesn't understand why this trend exists in the first place. They talk about incompatible habits as I think the main source of this. Our arguments about necessity matter more, about economic necessity, about necessity taking care of your parents, about women. That's the first part of the first extension. Second, I think our impacts about women are just much better than the sort of half-hearted treatment of that. They hand away about women needing quote unquote space. What actually is important for women is not having space to have your own house. What matters is being able to move cities, to have your own career, and not sacrifice for your husband. This is more important than there are other impacts for 2 reasons. One, it's more likely than any of their arguments about abuse, because I think if you're in an abusive relationship, it's hard to move in the first place. But B, I think it's a better argument, better mechanism for their argument about breakups. It's not about more about your SO, so you like them less. The argument is if you have better social circles, if you're more financially independent as a woman, that is what means cushions the impact of a breakup. Final reason why we take it over OG, I think we fill in the hole that is identified by overwhelming opposition. That is, it's not true that couples are 100% apart in different addresses or 100% together for the entirety of the relationship. In fact, it's a mix, and I think we've identified why that mix increases the optionality given by people. Next, on closing opposition, a couple of responses here. Their argument is basically that you have worse long-term relationships because it's hard to communicate, you don't check up on your spouse, etc. One, I think this is actually a good simulation of long-term relationships. That is, I think in the long term, you lose the excitement, you like either the sexual attraction or the excitement of a new relationship. And I think that's simulated by long distance. So it's actually good practice for long-term relationships when their sort of initial excitement wears off. But second, I think it teaches you to prioritize and communicate appropriately. That is, you learn, you have to actively prioritize taking care of your husband. You have to actively prioritize communicating with them, so that actually builds important skills. And if it doesn't, then you just break up, which I think means that bites into all of OO's harms. Finally, I think that you get healthier relationships because you have a more robust social circle if you're not spending all of your time with your SO. That means that then the fact that you can offload some of the emotional burdens onto your friends instead of your significant other means that you depend less on your significant other, which then means that if they are not sort of unavailable for whatever reasons, that they're not required to do as much work, so it's more sustainable. Opening opposition.
The vast majority of people don't like distance and are going to live close by regardless. Long distance is just not the debate. Given that, CG fails to show why living 15 minutes away versus in the same apartment magically grants you a better career. Be realistic.
For the reasons you identified about financial reasons, about social pressures, the vast majority of cases in which this happens is long distance between cities, i.e. having to take different jobs, having to live separately because you're parents. for exactly the reasons you gave. Oh, well, quickly, why we take it over them. One, I think your argument, the core argument is just crazy. If there's lots of pressure to move in, it's really not clear why that pressure only kicks in after you're married. That is, if they're correct about that, then it's likely that you move in together, given the social pressures, before marriage. You spend 2 years living apart and then 2 years living together, and then maybe a year living apart and then maybe living together, which mitigates the vast majority of their impacts about breaking up sooner. Second, I think that if the thing you care about is the pressure to commit to relationships, about being pressured into relationships, the main pressure to commit is financial. It's being 30 and needing a tax break. It's being 30 and thinking that you need help and needing like a source of financial stability. It's not social, because I think that predominantly, most people can at least resist social pressures, financial pressures, feel more acute. So if the thing you care about then is that, then we are the ones who increase it, because we give women increased financial independence, which then means that you mitigate a lot of the pressures on marriage the opening of opposition talks about. I'll be happy to propose.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. Now, I would like to call upon opposition whip.
Just to check that I'm audible.
You're audible.
Cool. Okay. I'm going to do two things in the speech. Number one, on scrutiny about how we're preventing bad relationships. Secondly, the positive case about why living together is just generally good, makes people happier. That's a good thing. First thing is just in terms of framing who this debate applies to and how norms and pressure actually work. The first thing I would note in terms of weighing is that this is probably going to matter to people who which is realistically viable, right? I.e., like if I'm a very poor couple who really needs the resource pooling that opening opposition correctly identifies can occur, will likely perceive it as something, a trend that doesn't really apply to them, right? Like I can just see, oh, that's like another rich people trend. I clearly can't do it, meaning that will not follow that trend. The reason why this matters and why this framing is so important, because A, all the opening opposition material on financial resource pooling is probably quite unimpactful, given that we are mostly talking about couples who are going to be financially fine either way if they are capable to follow that trend in the first place. What this means is that the most impactful bit on the debate and how we should weigh in terms of the bench is the quality of the relationship, and I'm going to explain later how we weigh over them in that. Similarly, I think the financial dependency material that happens that comes from opening and closing off is also marginal, right? Because A, most couples that will be dependent on become dependent on each other would not follow on their side, follow that trend on their side, or if they would be dependent regardless, because like one of them would probably be just like spending money on sustaining the other's flat, etc., etc. Like for that reason, like for the same like basic logistics, that wouldn't happen. Second thing, in terms of the optionality thing on CG, dealing with a couple of things they say. Number one, they say that it is good because people who want to like take care of their sick parents like are going to be able to do it. I would just know that like just reality check, like there is no pressure preventing people from doing that status quo. Like I just realistically, like if someone says like, I've never heard anyone saying you are a really bad person because you are taking care of your sick parent, you should be living with your partner. Like this is literally a normal thing that people generally do, and it's completely accepted. Second, like moving for your job, right? Either you're going to have a partner who is supportive, meaning that you can do it, move with them / just do it like without the trend regardless, or B, if they are not supportive on our side, they're not going to be supportive on their side either, meaning that they are more likely to be pressuring you, or you're going to feel the pressure to stay like in a residential address that is very close to like to the address of your partner. Like I think opening opposition is correct in the POI, the point is probably not about long distance, and it doesn't matter. Clarifying that, let's talk about scrutiny and preventing bad relationship. Talking about OO, I would just know that opening up makes that case largely dependent on the idea that you will move in together eventually because of societal pressure. Like I would know that the trend would likely remove a lot of that pressure, right? Like we're going to be charitable to Goff that they'd be probably able to use the trend to do this long term without pressure. Like
I think the thing is that the trend is probably going to happen, like apply to certain communities, and it's not going to apply to others. Like for example, like the hipsters in New York, it's probably going to become normalized, right? Like the 80% of those people are going to do it, then the normalization is going to happen. When it comes to religious people in Alabama, none of them are probably going to do it. I don't think we're talking about those in this debate either. But in the groups that we are talking about, the pressure actually is going to get removed. It's actually going to get normalized because of that. I think that opening opposition has very little left if the pressure to move together eventually is not going to occur. The last thing that they just say is that you can't learn things about each other, but just note is under-explained, right? Like if I probably would notice if my partner does with the toilet seat, if I go to their flat and I see what they're doing with their toilet seat. Like I just don't think they explain at all about why you need to live together to have that. Given that, what does CoD give you about why it is crucially important in terms of preventing bad relationship to live together? The point is that moving together is a massive and huge decision that works as a signaling effect. That is, you know that there will be a huge codependency, and both I am going to be aware and my surroundings are going to be aware of this. What this means is that huge scrutiny occurs, right? It is not about like habits like toilet seats, etc. It's about like general behavior patterns, like toxic red flags. The thing is that what happens on our side, my family, myself, my friends are going to scrutinize and discuss that decision, right? They will sit me down because there's a clear marker when the relationship is becoming serious, and they will be like, okay, you're moving in with this person, like what about this thing, what about that thing? I'm going to think about it. I want to very clearly what is it? I'm going to be clearly thinking about all the problems that might potentially occur. What happens on their side is that scrutinization doesn't happen at any point because there is no clear marker that would actually make it work. What this means is that the dependency occurs anyway, right? Like it just happens slowly and it happens unchecked. Like financially, you're still going to get kind of together. Like you're still going to have common friends, common groups, like isolation from other friends, etc. This can happen. The problem is there's never a point of scrutiny. What this means is that you're going to, like on our side, we are significantly better in preventing bad relationship and creating relationships that are healthier. We do this better in opening opposition because we are not dependent on the idea that like, oh, it's going to be bad because you move in eventually. Especially if you don't move in eventually, we're just proving that you're going to be stuck in relationships that are going to long-term become horrible, as opposed to on our side when you're able to escape from them significantly quicker. Second thing then about why living together is good. Just from the sort of positive way in terms of emotional intimacy, opening government has like the big thing about like you're going to get sick of each other because you don't have any separate space. Just to challenge that, like number one, you probably have separate space at home. Like you don't live in a studio, you're probably going to have like 2 different rooms, 1 office or whatever, something like that. Meaning that you cannot, like you don't have to interact with your partner all the fucking time. Second, you probably have jobs. 3, you probably have separate hobbies, friends, you go to pubs, you go to your friends' places. I think the thing is then that you get physical space on our side. On their side, this becomes bad, right? Because when I come home from work, I have to go and commute to my partner. I'm less likely to do it because I'm a bit tired. I don't want to do it. It's much bigger commitment. On our side, you then have physical space, but you also have proximity of your partner. Take opening right now.
Often when people are sad or tired, they might also need space to themselves just as much to reflect. Communication not being a foundation,
Okay.
why the debate of is more about other people.
I get it. Okay, if I'm sad and I want to have space for myself, I'm going to go and sit in my bedroom, in my office. I'm going to go outside and sit in a park, or I'm going to go and sit in the bathroom or the toilet. The point is that I can do that if I live with someone. The problem is I can't do it if I want to not to be alone. I can't do it as effectively on your side, right? I'm going to have too much space. I'm going to have space when I don't want to have it. The thing then is now I have the capacity to be close to my partner when I need it, right? I come home, someone is there, is close. I don't have to reach out and text them, can I come over? The communication is normalized, right? Like I feel sad in the evening and I want my girlfriend to be close to me. I can immediately ask and reach out there. It is not an option on their side, right? Because like there is a coercion, there is going to be insecurity to ask about that commitment from that person because it's no longer a normal thing. This is small and it sounds like a soft impact, right? But note that it is a day-to-day massive thing, right? The happiness and the little things that happen to individuals on the ground matters the most, right? Like this is what I'm thinking about that makes me happy, that makes my life overall good. What this means is that it is even that small impact is still better than the huge unproven stuff that other teams say. For all those both reasons, closing off.
Thank you very much for that fine speech, and thank you all for the debate. So please leave the breakout room, and we call you back in 15 minutes.
Thank you so much.